The hockey world in the 1980s was dominated by one team, the Edmonton Oilers. Making the finals for the first time in 1982-83 and getting swept by the New York Islanders kickstarted what would be one of the longest stretches dominated by a single NHL team in the post-expansion era. Everyone knows about the Gretzky trade, but what happened to the other members of that squad? How and why did the Oilers lose Coffey, Messier, Fuhr, Curry, and all the other Hall of Famers that played for that team?
How did the Oilers go from perennial Stanley Cup champions to a small market team of underdogs? My name is Zach, and I'm going to break down the collapse of one of the best teams in NHL history. Before we get into the video, remember to like, subscribe, and comment down below if you agree with me. Let's jump into it.
The Oilers were constantly adding new players to try and make their roster fit, but the first significant crack in the dynasty appeared in 1987. Shortly after the Oilers won their third cup in 86-87, the Oilers star defenseman Paul Coffey was traded from Edmonton to Pittsburgh. Coffey had won the Norris Trophy the prior 2 seasons and had just played an instrumental role in Edmonton capturing their third cup of the decade. Coffey had been under contract since 1983-84 when he signed a 6-year deal for $320,000 per season. However, after copious amounts of personal and team success over the next 4 seasons, in September of 1987, Coffey approached GM Glenn Sather and owner Peter Pocklington about renegotiating the final 2 years on his contract. Pocklington refused, and 2 months later, on November 25, 1987, a 26-year-old Paul Coffey was sent to the Pittsburgh Penguins to help build the NHL's next great dynasty. The Oilers' owner was constantly facing financial troubles throughout the 1980s. That played a significant role in the breakup of this team. There was so much success and everyone deserved to get paid, but Pocklington simply couldn't afford to pay everyone, or anyone for that matter. The first sign of financial uncertainty facing Pocklington appeared in the Coffey trade, but it really became apparent a year and a half later when on August 9, 1988, Wayne Gretzky was sold to the Los Angeles Kings. The Kings sent some players back in the deal, including a young 107-point phenom Jimmy Carson, but the centerpiece of the trade was the $15 million Los Angeles sent to Edmonton. Without the money, this deal never happens. Everyone knows the story of the Gretzky trade and how hard people like Sather fought to keep him. In the end, none of it made a difference. Pocklington needed the money, and Gretzky ended up in a Kings jersey. Somehow, even after trading away the best player in NHL history, the Oilers still wound up with a competitive team for 2 more seasons. They capped off this era in franchise history, winning the Stanley Cup in 1989-90, led by Messier and Curry, sans Gretzky. In the 2 seasons following the 1990 Stanley Cup, the Oilers' dynasty would fully collapse for everyone to see. Once Gretzky was traded, an ending like this was inevitable, but very few saw the team crashing and burning so hard and so fast. The 1990-91 season began with Jari Kurri playing overseas for Milano in Italy. His contract had expired and the Oilers had won the Stanley Cup, and when Peter Pocklington couldn't meet his contract demands, a curious Jari Kurri ventured overseas to see what pro hockey outside the NHL was like. Glenn Sather would eventually facilitate a deal to send Curry to Philly. He eventually returned to the NHL with the following season when Philly flipped him to LA, reuniting him with his longtime line mate Wayne Gretzky. Grant Fuhr got suspended 60 games for violating the NHL's drug policies at the beginning of the 1990-91 season. Fuhr would play 13 more games with the Oilers before being packaged with Glenn Anderson and Craig Berube in a larger deal that would see Vincent Damphousse as the key piece sent back to the Oilers, along with Peter Eng, Luke Richardson, Scott Thornton, future considerations, and cash. Although Damphousse was good for the 1 season he played in Edmonton, he ultimately requested a trade in a large part due to being unhappy, and the Oilers obliged, sending him to Montreal for Shane Corson, Brent Gilchrist, and Vladimir Vucetic. With Gretzky, Coffey, Curry, Fuhr, and Anderson gone, Mark Messier saw the writing on the wall. He knew his days in Edmonton were numbered. Messier was under contract until 1992-93, but he grew increasingly frustrated with the Oilers' seemingly unwillingness to pay their stars. Privately, Pocklington simply couldn't afford to pay anyone, and knew that he would eventually lose Messier for nothing. So they took action, trading Messier for cheap cross-controlled players. Messier was the last core member from the glory years Pocklington had left, and on October 4th, 1991, Mark Messier was traded to the New York Rangers. In return, the Oilers acquired Louis DeBrusk, Bernie Nichols, and Stephen Rice. In a shocking turn of events, years later, Pocklington would tell the public that on top of the players he received, he also got $2 million in cash for the Messier trade. Within a 13-month span from September 1990 to October 1991, the Oilers' identity completely changed. They went from an undefeatable giant in the world of hockey, an unfathomably great team, to a small market organization that could barely afford to stay in the NHL. The league's perception of Edmonton changed entirely. The Oilers sent some of the best players in NHL history out the door and received players who weren't half as good as what they sent away. While there were probably better deals available for some of those assets, Pocklington's inability to pay for good players had the Oilers searching for cheap bargains. Any deal the Oilers made for their stars saw cash as the key return. Financial management was a larger priority than icing a good hockey team. The signs of financial peril first showed themselves when Gretzky was traded. And to this day, if you ask Glenn Sather about the Gretzky trade, he will correct you and call it the Gretzky sale. To this day, Peter Pocklington will deny the role his personal finances played in selling off his stars, but make no mistake, money is the number one reason the Oilers dynasty collapsed. In the season that followed, the Oilers roster would look completely different from the juggernaut they once were. Icing lineups of primarily unknown and underpaid players with the hopes that they would play just good enough to stay in Edmonton, but not too good enough that they would leave to a bigger market like New York. In the final years of Pocklington's ownership, the team was a disaster. Year after year, star players were costing more money to maintain. Due to Pocklington's inability to pay star players, the Oilers had a hard time keeping fans in the building. Pocklington was getting squeezed. This inability to generate funds came to a head when in 1993, Pocklington tried to move the Oilers to Hamilton, Ontario. Pocklington would battle with the city, the NHL, and Oilers fans for years before finally putting the team up for sale in 1998. A Houston investor made a bid for $70 million. 30 days were then given to find a local bidder who would keep the team in Edmonton. A group of 38 local investors came together to raise $70 million, keep the team locally, and the EIG was born. Pocklington held on to the Oilers for far too long. There were plenty of signs that he couldn't afford to keep the Oilers. By holding on, he was only hurting the city of Edmonton and prolonging his inevitable demise as owner, which came exactly 10 years after he first signaled to the public that he was having financial problems. The Oilers are a storied franchise who have been lucky enough to ice some of the best players in NHL history. The end of the 80s dynasty was a tumultuous time in Oilers history, and the demolition of that team shaped the way the franchise would be seen for the next 30 years.